In an ever-evolving world, there is always a need to go with a change. The one that stops progressing becomes oblivious. Since the invention of computers, the world has continuously strived for technological advancement. This resulted in computers becoming compact and telephones becoming handy. And now is the phase when we are witnessing Industrial Revolution 4.0, which incorporates artificial intelligence among others. This gives rise to the necessity of more sophisticated products and commodities, the major among them being semiconductors. But the vested trade interests now seem to destabilize this attempt. The first blow to global aspiration has come from the US. But India has clearly indicated that it is in no mood to let the US compromise its efforts. Namaste and welcome to TFIPost. I'm your host Paurish Gupta. Let's begin. The World Trade Organization, or better known as WTO, routinely reviews the trade policies of individual member countries. Reports highlight that during the US trade policy review, India opposed the US CHIPS Act, which was announced in August last year. India raised the objection, citing the WTO provisions and termed the act disadvantageous for other countries. Further, New Delhi also sought clarification from the United States regarding this act. As per the official statement, India asked this puts more competitive manufacturers globally at a distinct disadvantage. What steps are proposed to be taken to create an even playing field for global manufacturers in these areas, especially from the developing world? Interestingly, along with India, China too questioned the US Act. It is noteworthy that China is in feud with the USA on semiconductor export ban issue. It has also filed a lawsuit against the US in the WTO. In the trade policy review, China raised the issue, saying China notes that the US has continuously criticized the industrial subsidy policies of other member nations on various occasions over the years. Please clarify whether the consistent position of the US has changed. Replying to this, the USA has said that it is intended to act in a manner that is consistent with the US laws and with US commitments under the WTO agreement. But is that so? There is a WTO agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures, SCM agreement. Some of the provisions of the US Act violate these WTO agreements. But before that, let us understand the semiconductor dynamics across the world, due to which things are getting more conflicting. Let's rewind a bit. The pandemic and Ukraine conflict disrupted the global supply chains of semiconductors. Being the most important industry hardware in the electronic industry, there was hardly any technological-based sector that remained unaffected. Each country initiated the effort to augment its capabilities in developing the semiconductor ecosystem. India too started developing infrastructure for the same and launched the Semicon India program with an outlay of $10 billion in 2021. The key objective of this program was to set up fabrication labs for developing R&D and designs to compete with the major players in Asia. In 2022, semiconductor fabrication was allotted an additional outlay of $10 billion under the PLI scheme. In August 2022, the US, on the other hand, passed a piece of legislation called the Creating Helpful Incentives to Produce Semiconductors for America CHIPS Act. As per the provisions of the Act, the government will provide $52 billion in subsidies and a total of $280 billion in incentives to restore America's dominance in global semiconductor manufacturing. Going by the numbers, it is interesting to note that US is the dominant player in the manufacturing of semiconductors. The most critical part of semiconductor production is electronic device automation, better known as EDA, which designs the chip before it is manufactured. EDA is a costly process for mainly two reasons. Firstly, each end product demands different semiconductors, thereby demanding different software automation. Lastly, this complex process requires skilled engineers and vast R&D. And being the most competent country in current times, the US dominated EDA with a share of more than 74%. So whatever the manufacturing capacity of China, Hong Kong and Taiwan, without the US, semiconductor fabrication is a hard nut to crack, almost impossible. One example of this is Apple. It designs its own chips, while the manufacturing of the chips is outsourced. It is not like China never worked out the details of semiconductor architecture, but the chance of success are very low and the cost incurred is very high. Every year, $20 billion in investment is required in chip fabrication, research and development. A tiny square inch of a chip contains humongous number of transistors placed just nanometers apart, making the chip more powerful with greater transistor density. Apple's iPhone 13 currently uses the most advanced 5 nanometer chip, while their upcoming iPad is expected to be the first to use a 3 nanometer chip, which offers a 15% faster speed and 25% lower power consumption compared to the 5 nanometer chips. In contrast, China's most advanced chip is 14 nanometer, which is at least 2 generations behind the 5 nanometer chip, despite the country's 2 decades of significant government funding. This demonstrates how much the system is dominated by the United States. In such a challenging market as well as technological competition, India's dream of becoming a semiconductor hub is no less than facing headwinds. In its effort, the geopolitical conditions along with the domestic push acted as reinforcement. The US wants to reduce Chinese dominance so that its influence can be contained. This also gives an advantage to India. This was evident in the so-called chip war between the US and China. As a result, Taiwanese companies are ready to relocate to India. The US also supported the cause, at least on paper. India and USA recently launched ICET, Initiative for Critical and Emerging Technologies, under which semiconductor fabrication in India was also to be supported. Along with that, recently US Secretary of Commerce Gianna Raimondo traveled to India to sign the Memorandum of Understanding with Commerce and Industry Minister Piyush Goyal. The MOU is based on the semiconductor supply chain and innovation partnership. But since hypocrisy has always been the USP of United States, it took no time to show its real colors. Actually, India is exhausting its capital on semiconductor fabrication because of the domestic demand for electronic goods and electric vehicles is continuously rising. It does not want to become dependent on foreign players, especially China. But this will face more chances of failure because of the US Chip Act. The incentivization and subsidy will make US semiconductors cheap and technologically faster. This will certainly disrupt market norms, and the Indian startups will eventually take the biggest hit. The US Act is heavily criticized on the basis of the same. It is argued that the US Act will not only affect China but also affect other manufacturers in India and Asia. But one can say that any country will think of its own market and people. True, but it is the same US that opposes subsidies and incentives, citing WTO provisions. WTO provisions under the SCM agreement clearly prohibit certain types of subsidies that are considered to be trade distorting. These include export subsidies, which are subsidies that are contingent on export performances, and subsidies that are tied to the use of domestic goods over imported goods. So the Indian criticism of the US is actually the most important step which was desperately needed. The step evidently shows that the current Indian approach to the world is more pragmatic and less idealistic. This is certainly going to reap benefits for India in the near future.